episode of Chatty Broads with Becca and Jess.
Well, hello, broads.
Hello.
How are all of you? We're dropping a day earlier than we typically drop. It's almost back to our regularly scheduled programming here.
I know. Even though we will not have that back, it seems, for a long time. We were just discussing the whole Bachelor schedule, and it's just crazy.
Yeah, Matt James season, though, it's going to be back to the Tuesday,
but
Thursday, per usual. I know. It's a whole wild world.
And you said the first 2 weeks of his season are going to be double episodes, or just the first week? Or
I think the first week.
Oh, my.
It's a lot. It's a lot of Bachelor. But today we're not
talking about the Bachelor.
We're not talking about the Bachelor. And in fact, today is Thursday, which I'm sure a lot of you are spending the holiday of Thanksgiving on. And Becca and I, we've been going through the past couple episodes. We've been talking about conversations on race. We've been talking about anti-racism, being a co-conspirator, as Michaela brought up in our last episode. And we really, really today wanted to have a conversation about Indigenous peoples. And Becca, you put on your Instagram a reach out for some folks. And so many amazing people contacted us. But we are so grateful and so excited to have Tai Simpson and Cali Wolf in the building. Yay! Or on the Zoom, not in the building. Thank you both so much for coming. We so appreciate it.
Of course. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us. I'm really excited to have this conversation, especially since I am an avid Chatty Broads listener.
Yes,
love it. So thank you for holding this space for us.
Oh, thank you so much. So, broads, we have to take a quick pause, and I want to talk with you all about a company that I am a huge fan of. The fact of the matter is, my hair can be a struggle for me. I've talked about this before, and what I always hope to do is add some body to it without it being too dry, but then it gets too moisturized or like filled with conditioner, and then it gets, I don't know, kind of thin, and it's hard to explain. It's a drama for me, though. But I finally have won the battle because I found Function of Beauty, my own personalized shampoo and conditioner.
Function of Beauty is pretty incredible. Mm-hmm. It's actually 100% custom, creating unique solutions just for you. Okay, first step, you'll take a quick online quiz because everyone's hair is so different. Your texture, length, whether your hair's colored or not, there's a lot of factors at play. Step 2, the Function of Beauty team, they mix up your custom formulas based on your responses. And step 3, your bottles are packaged up and they're delivered right to your door.
And again, all these formulas are not only extremely effective, my hair is more luscious, it's more full, and it's softer than ever before all at once, thanks to my Function of Beauty formulas. But they also are made using only clean ingredients. Plus, they're vegan, cruelty-free. I love mine, Becca loves hers, and it's safe to say that we're not alone because Function of Beauty has already racked up over 50,000 5-star reviews.
Wow.
Have you ever heard of that many 5-star reviews?
That's a lot of 5-star reviews.
That is a lot of 5-star reviews and well earned. So if you've grown tired of trying every hair product your local market has to offer, consider this a sign. Make the switch today.
What are you waiting for? Go to functionofbeauty.com/broads to take your quiz and save 20% off your hair care order. That's functionofbeauty.com/broads for 20% off.
There is a universal struggle that exists among almost everyone, broads, and that is figuring out what to buy your dad or your partner for the holidays.
I was just having this conversation on the phone with my sister. We're like, what do we
We never
get?
know, right?
Yeah.
Every single year, I ask my dad what he wants for Christmas, and he hits me with I already have everything I want. And I'm like, oh my gosh, you're so sweet, Dad, but tell me what you want for Christmas because I can't figure this out. Well, thanks to Hawthorne, I now have a one-stop shop for all of that.
Hawthorne is the premium personal care brand that's making it easy for guys to feel and smell their best, which I'm sure some of the dads or partners or people we know and love could use a little bit of help in that department. No shade. And the best part is the whole process is super tailored, which completely elevates the experience and it makes something potentially mundane like personal care feel really extra special. So you start off by taking a quick quiz so the team at Hawthorne can get a feel for who you're shopping for. I love these quick quizzes. So many brands are implementing them now, and it makes life so much easier. Instead of having to scroll through all these different products, you're going to get stuff that's customized to what you're looking for.
I know exactly what I want.
Yeah. Anyway, so you'll be asked questions like, how does your guy or this person spend a night out? What's his drink of choice? Mm-hmm. A few other fun questions to get insights.
It's very exciting. Based on your answer, Hawthorne curates a few high-quality products specifically tailored to that person in your life, but especially perfect for those impossible to shop for, men. So I got my dad one of these sets for Christmas, and after I took the gift quiz, it included work cologne, his out and about cologne. It included body wash, face wash, moisturizer, and more that are just specific for him. And by the way, I guess it's been a year ago now, I was out and about and I was talking to a gentleman and I was like smelling him and I'm like, I don't mean to be inappropriate, but I need to know what you're wearing because you smell so good. And it was Hawthorne. So yeah, I'll be buying that for the hubs too. So Hawthorne even takes out the risk, by the way, by giving you free shipping on all orders and returns. So your holiday shopping just got a whole lot easier.
Find the perfect gift this holiday season by visiting hawthorne.co/gift. That's HAWTHORNE.co/gift. Hawthorne.co/gift.
So we would love to have maybe some quick intros or not so quick intros about both of you. And I know both of you are involved in different areas of work and just, your backgrounds would be great.
Okay. Tatslahain, inem winiktwa, satit watit. In my Indigenous language, I said good day, and my name is the Storyteller. Soyapo winiktwas Tai Simpson. In English, my name is Tai Simpson. Inwas Nimiipuu ayet. Inem nixasa hiwis, timina ilp kanich, laloitzat kina. In my nation, I am a citizen of the Nimiipuu Nation. I also identify as Black. I am a descendant of Chief Redheart of the Nez Perce Nation. In the community, I am an activist and an organizer with the Indigenous Idaho Alliance, and then I work as an advocate for the Idaho Coalition Against Sexual and Domestic Violence. I essentially use storytelling, anti-racism education, and anti-oppression work to essentially interrupt cycles of violence in both Black and Indigenous communities. So I'm just out here trying to damn the man, burn it all down.
That's a great intro.
Han mitakiepi, that means hello, my relatives, a common greeting in Lakota. I am Sicangu Lakota from South Dakota, and I'm currently living on Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Ute lands in Denver, Colorado, where I work as a board-certified emergency nurse. And I'm also the coordinating director for Native Women's Wilderness, and we are an aspiring nonprofit. I think we're in the bylaws section of that. But we aim to inspire and educate and help Native women, girls, and non-binary relatives get outdoors, and also to educate the public about ancestral lands and whose lands we're on.
Well, speaking of that, and speaking of lands, can we maybe hop into that just kind of right off the top? I know that some of the conversations, especially in recent days, at least for us, again, I'm talking as a white person who this was not part of a lot of the education that I had in my schooling system. I all of a sudden started to see land back. We're talking about whose land you're on. And then I started doing some research looking at that. Could we talk about that?
Yeah. And even in college, it's kind of crazy. Like even in higher education, I learned a lot about, a lot of different things, but not really anything about Indigenous lands or what land we were on. Yeah, I'm adding to that.
Yeah, you're bringing up a couple of different issues that culminate into like why we are in the place that we're in. Thank you, Cali, for reminding me. I am broadcasting from Niwa and Numu territory, so those are commonly known as Shoshone, Bannock, Paiute, and Yakima nations. Boise, Idaho is what we now call it, colonized territory. Land back initiatives have stemmed from the Lakota people after they had a direct action and protest against Trump coming to Mount Rushmore. So many folks don't know that Mount Rushmore, Seven Devils, the Black Hills, those are all Indigenous cultural and spiritual landmarks. So the land back initiatives aren't just about acknowledging that these are dispossessed lands, but it's also about like, just give the damn land back, right? I'm not a big proponent of land acknowledgements for that reason, where we're like, it's touchy-feely, it feels progressive, it's all the warm fuzzies, oh, Indigenous people used to live here. But it's also recognizing that we were dispossessed very forcefully, very violently. And land back initiatives, one, acknowledge that historical atrocity, and two, encourage our accomplices, our white folks who are in the practice of being our accomplices and co-conspirators, are actively engaged in trying to get our land back to us. What's really interesting is when folks hear land back, white folks especially hear land back, it's as if we're going to kick you all out. Like you're all living
panic.
now. like where are we gonna go? Well, I mean, you're here now. Like it's fine. But land back is an initiative about making sure that land stewardship is in the hands of Indigenous people. White folks have shown us over the course of 200 to 400 years that y'all are why we can't have nice things like the overharvesting of animals and plants, extraction industries, so oil and fossil fuels, ores, silver, gold, iron, and then just the sheer depletion of access. So I am Nimiipuu, or from the Nez Perce Nation. We had access to nearly 70 million acres of ancestral territory pre-contact, pre-settler colonialist contact. And now we are stewards of 700,000 acres. So again, 70 million acres now depleted down to 700,000. So that has an adverse effect on us socially, culturally, economically, and we're still feeling those effects even today.
Yeah, actually, there was a case, I believe, last year, maybe you know a little bit more about this than I do, in Eureka, California, where they returned 200 acres of land back to the Indigenous, I think it's the Wyote tribe, and that was known as Indian Island. And the public can still visit this land. The local tribe is in ownership and stewardship of that land. And so it's not always referring to a non-native person giving an Indigenous person their home, but allowing us to have stewardship and management. And another topic that comes up when we discuss this is wildfires. And we know that Indigenous nations have been doing controlled burns or cultural burns for centuries and have been able to hold off such rampant wildfires that we're experiencing today. So that's another reason why it's important to have Indigenous people manage these lands that we have known for so many centuries.
Tai, I had a question. You're using the term dispossessment. What does that mean, and why the use of that term versus like another term like displacement?
Well, it's both. I thank you. Like identifying that language and what language we use is important. It was forced displacement. It was violent dispossession. Those things are synonymous. Okay. The displacement refers to us being able to freely move on our ancestral homeland, now being displaced to an Indian reservation. Those reservations aren't designed to be some like utopia for Indigenous people. They were literally a prison with a fort or more than one fort on that reservation to keep us culled and corralled into this small space, since we were no longer allowed to move freely or migrate freely or harvest game or fish or our roots and berries freely. So that's the displacement, the forced displacement piece. The forced dispossession, of course, is not being able to steward lands that we've been on. Like my tribe has archaeological and geographical evidence of 15,000 years on our homeland. And so that our ways of knowing that are passed from generation to generation, while we don't consider them science because it's not published in some peer-reviewed journal, it is science. It is geography. It is geology. Like we know the land better than anybody because we've been stewards of the land for so many generations. 15,000 years is science. That's not mythology or folklore, you know?
So maybe we need to go back a little bit into this history that I think a lot of us just don't really know about. Even as you're talking about this, I'm like, I guess I don't really even know how logistically Indigenous people were forced into these reservations. I actually don't know anything about that or what things really looked like outside of cowboy movies that you see growing up. And that's sure not a great way to get educated about these
not
issues.
An accurate representation.
No. So maybe we could just sort of go back to just basic history. Yeah. We talked about this on the last episode. I didn't know until recently that it was literally millions and millions and millions of Indigenous peoples. It's sort of the way it's represented in history as you learn it. It seems like it's like several thousand, which I know sounds silly to say, but it's sort of the way that it has been represented in a lot of our education growing up. Instead of entire like massacre of people.
Yeah, I actually was raised in a predominantly white area, a really small farm town outside of Chicago, Illinois. And my school experience is very similar despite being Native myself. I was a token Native, so I didn't have any other Native classmates or friends until I was an adult and actually left the area. But I recently stumbled across a 4th grade social studies notebook. And I'm sure you can imagine what I had found in my own handwriting, that, the settlers were nice to the natives, that John Smith was nice to the natives. I experienced exactly what I think most white Americans experienced in the public school system. So I can relate to that. And I relate to, finding out what actually happened as an adult. I remember my dad gave me the book, which is written by a white author, but it's besides the point. Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee by Dee Brown. And he told me, Cali, this is going to be hard to read. And I thought he meant this is going to be boring. It's history. History is boring. But it took me a couple chapters to realize what he meant was that it was emotionally hard. I still to this day haven't gotten more than halfway through the book. And that's just a glimpse at the history from, pre-colonial times until now. So as a Native person trying to catch up or trying to unlearn and relearn, it has been really emotionally tolling on me. So there are times where I have to kind of step back and, this isn't the time for me to learn about this right now. So I have, that kind of unique experience with where I was raised and where I grew up. But a lot of my peers, still are very, I don't want to say ignorant, but it is ignorant about what we experienced in the past, what we experience today, and current struggles that are still going on. My first personal struggle, I guess, would be with the Dakota Access Pipeline. Mm-hmm. I remember just sitting in my house and thinking, I feel this pull and I need to do something and I don't know what to do. I'm so new to this fight and I'm not sure where I'm needed. And it was just in my heart that I was drawn there. And that really kind of kickstarted my whole experience and journey and, reconnecting and relearning my culture, my language, ceremonies, and everything. So I just wanted to share that little bit of background information with this all, because I do relate to the topic of education and how we've missed so much.
That's such a true story. And it's by design, right? I also grew up, oddly enough, was born in Peoria, Illinois. Spent some time in Chicago. Yeah, so yay. Country so small. I grew up in predominantly white neighborhoods, predominantly white schools, but that was by design. My father having grown up in South Chicago, where it is all of this stereotypical urban Black community disparities that you could imagine. And it was his mission to keep us from that, us being me and my brother. I appreciate what he was trying to do. I can code switch like a boss now, in and out of with white folks, with Black folks, with Indigenous people. And that's a useful skill and a useful tool to navigate the world that we're in. But regarding the education piece, that's a symptom of colonization, right? So colonization by design is meant to entirely strip and deplete Indigenous people of our cultures, our language, and our land, and replace it with whiteness and patriotism and Western academic standards. Mm-hmm. And what that means is you're not going to learn that it was a few million, if not hundreds of millions of Indigenous people that were wiped out, a genocide, an annihilation. Rather, it's a few thousand. It's just a small massacre, a blip in the history of Indigenous people. Right. Because when that's the case, it's hard to humanize us that way, right? It's when we remain dehumanized and when we remain marginalized, it's easy to justify the continued theft of our land, the continued dishonoring of our treaties. Like any number of those things are meant to take place by design because of colonization. My mom had to work really hard to counteract the same thing that Cali went through, like reading about myself in a 4th grade social studies book versus what the stories my mom was actually telling me at home. Like, fortunately, my mom is equally as radical as I am, very deeply and spiritually grounded in being Nimiipuu and being a matriarch, that I was able to always know that Columbus was not who the book said he was, that John Smith was a rapist and that was an instance of human trafficking, that we were not, Thanksgiving wasn't about friendship, it was about a massacre of Indigenous people. So those things are meant to, that's why the work that we do now when it comes to anti-racism, when it comes to decolonization, when it comes to anti-oppression, is about looking back into history and learning history from the very truthful place, despite how tumultuous and gut-wrenching it is to reread it in its truest form, so that we can start to make amends and move forward in a way that makes us good neighbors, in a way that makes sure that Indigenous communities are liberated and have enough. Because even to this day, I mean, everything that we're talking about isn't historical. Indigenous communities, like 5,700 missing and murdered Indigenous women across the country right now, the disparities, clean access to water, internet as a utility versus a luxury. Like, so many of those things remain disparities the most amongst Indigenous people and Native American tribes. Another big example is the Dene people, or Navajo people as we know them, have the highest rates of coronavirus per capita. And it's a very rural and remote reservation. It covers 4 states. And so some of these awareness campaigns around COVID and staying safe and staying healthy couldn't reach people because they just simply didn't have the internet. And if they don't know to stay at home and self-isolate, they're going to continue to have community and cultural events without understanding the risk, which is why the adverse impact takes place. I'm not surprised that you didn't know. I'm not surprised that you don't. Like, that's something that I come up against every time that I have conversations like these, or anytime I host, conversations around Native American history and how to be better moving forward, like what partnerships could look like with tribes. So it's frustrating, but we can undo it. It's possible to undo it.
Yeah. It's kind of what you were saying, Cali, like, going through, I recently, I have a 5-year-old daughter now. And so, we're trying to have different conversations than I had when I was younger. And so I was going through old homeschooling books that I had. And when I was reading through the history books, it was, shocking to say the least now. And I just know just a small piece. So one of the things that I did want to touch on were some of the, the common lies that we are taught, like you were saying, Tai, because of colonization, that we are taught in the United States through education about the history of Indigenous people in this country.
Common misconceptions, I guess.
Yes.
Yeah. I have one that was, somebody recently said to me that they thought that we just stopped speaking our language and practicing our cultures because we wanted to fit into American culture. And I think a lot of people may think this way because we've never been taught otherwise, unless you've experienced it or have a family member who has experienced cultural genocide, which is exactly what happened. And this is about boarding schools, which was not in our textbooks, certainly not in our 4th grade textbooks. And this has impacted probably all of our family members up until my dad's generation. I know that my great-great-grandfather was sent from central South Dakota to Pennsylvania to Carlisle Indian Boarding School, which was one of the first, if not the first, and most well-known boarding schools. And the man who founded this idea, Captain Richard Pratt, is known for his quote saying, all the Indian there is left in the race should be dead. Kill the Indian in him and save the man. So they wanted to rid us of our cultural ways and turn us into civilized Americans, and I was able to find a picture of my great-great-grandfather post-boarding school era. And, when they entered these schools, they were young children, elementary school, taken away from their families. They'd never been away from their families. They had such ties to their language and culture and ceremonies, but they were put into these institutions where they were forced to cut their hair, which is a very traumatizing experience in our culture. Our hair, long hair is an extension of our spirit. They were forced to speak English. They were forbidden from speaking their native languages, whether that's Lakota or other languages. Forced to take new names, to take white Christian names. And they experienced a lot of abuse at these boarding schools. A lot of them died due to abuse. A lot of them died due to illness and disease, due to being inside, which was, your body has to adapt from being mostly outdoors to now being inside. And because they were homesick, and there's stories of these families who would travel thousands of miles to be near the schools, just near them. They couldn't see their children, but they would set up outside the school just to be closer. And this is something that really has impacted all of us. And there's reasons why I didn't grow up learning Lakota language. Our grandparents were forbidden. They had to make these tough decisions on, should I just not speak it so that they are never harmed for it? And I would say that, just speaking with my dad, I kind of feel like I'm the first person in our family who has been able to pursue that without harm. I'm able to openly learn and speak my language without having to fear for my safety. It was in his generation where the American Indian Religious Freedom Act was passed in 1978. So that was like a little over 40 years ago. And before that, it was illegal for us to practice our ways, for us to have ceremony. And so that was during his lifetime. So that just brings some truth to how just from one generation to the next, things are so different. So that's a little bit on a really heavy topic.
It's interesting that you bring up the cultural erasure too, because I just thought of an example. My dad's Mexican, and when he went to school as a kindergartner here in California, his name was Jose, and the teacher, like the first thing that she said when he sat down was like, we're going to call you Joe. And so ever since then, his name has been Joe. And it's like, there's examples even in he's not that old, in our public education systems now, of like erasing someone's culture to be replaced by, white European name. Like the name is the essence of who you are. It's pretty, it's just, it's violent.
Yeah. I was gonna say, it's like, that's the word we're looking for, is it's violent. Colonization is violent. Assimilation is violent. None of these things took place in a peaceful, liberated sort of way. This was about the subjugation of an entire chunk of humanity. And I think that like the historical ramifications of boarding schools and even like our modern public education systems are still just as damaging to our young people. I'm thankful also, just like Cali, to be able to learn and speak my language openly. And it also makes me really feel a sense of deep gratitude and big love for my ancestors that still fought to keep this language going, despite the violence and despite the rape and forced displacement. So I'm grateful in that way. To speak specifically to your question about some of these misconceptions, there's a few that stand out, like right in the front. There's this weird misconception about Indians, Native American tribes. Side note, I use Indigenous, Native American, American Indian, all like interchangeably. But I prefer to use Indigenous, but Indian country is Indian country. That term is based on treaty language with the federal government, but we now use it as like a giant Indian community that we are. So Indian country, like we are super impoverished reservations, right, that are dilapidated and unlivable, but we have all of this free money from casinos, right? So that's almost like a counterintuitive misconception on both sides, like a common stereotype on both sides, whether it's positive or negative. We don't get free education. We don't get free healthcare. We don't get like money from the government every month. Like these things are just really strange to me about how these ideas keep getting perpetuated. To give you like a new age contemporary example of how these misconceptions are harmful despite folks' best intentions, there are people who practice Native American culture. Like, so think about that for a second. Like, how do you practice something that encompasses nearly 700 tribes and 200 indigenous languages, right? There is no such thing as a practice of Native American culture. And then there are different pieces and practices of different tribes that are appropriated and bastardized. The selling of sage at Urban Outfitters is one example that comes to mind. The appropriation of indigenous artists being used in fine art and fashion without accrediting the original artist. People who use terms like spirit animal, if that's not an actual ceremonial spiritual practice of that community, then you don't have a spirit animal. That's not a thing that exists for white folks. Tribe, using the name tribe. We still use that also from federal treaty language, like tribe is, but we're not tribes, we're nations, right? Or communities, or, that's language that's also a misconception. And even the like historical untruths, like the story of Thanksgiving in particular, that one is a misconception. Pocahontas is not a story of true love. It's a story of human trafficking and sexual violence, which of course is a common thread across all Indigenous communities. Historically, 70% of the nations in the United States are matriarchies, which meant part of colonization was to dismantle the foundation of these communities by violating, assaulting, and murdering Indigenous women at a very rapid pace, right? If you don't have a woman to continue to make more babies, then essentially the tribe is going to, breed itself out of existence. And that's the same thing that goes with blood quantum systems, the system of blood quantum in the United States, right? So whether you're enrolled or not, and how that's determined for membership.
What is that?
Blood quantum. Blood quantum is a system instituted by the Bureau of Indian Affairs during the Indian Wars and our resettlement programs onto reservations that said, that gave us a fraction of blood based on which nation we belong to. So at the time, during the Indian Allotment Act, it was everybody that was a Nez Perce person, for example, on paper became 4/4 Native Nez Perce, or 4/4 Cayuse, or 4/4 something. And then genetically, when we started to have babies and build families, then we now become fractions of a particular nation. This is a really horrible systemic process of annihilation of a tribe, because if you think about it big picture, if a tribe breeds itself out of existence, there is no longer any reason or any people to honor the treaty with. And that's why it was about land accumulation, and it was to further steal land from our people. There are some nations that are decolonizing that process, where the nation is determining who is a member and who isn't. The communities are determining who is afforded enrollment and who is participating in the culture and showing up in the community in a good way, which is really good. Like, the people should be determining who their people are. But that's not always the case. Like, I am Nez Perce, but I also have an actual identification card that tells you I'm Nez Perce and then the degree of Indian blood that I am. And the only creatures on the planet that have that are Native Americans, dogs, and horses. So it really is a very dehumanizing system, and very painful, especially when it came to the displacement of families to boarding schools, and then part of their homecoming. Like, then what happens to those folks, right?
Yeah, I had questions about this just regarding identity in general as an Indigenous person, because they're, like, you have literally your identification card. But then I'm also curious about people who have been displaced or have lost literally all of their family. Like, I'm thinking of children going to boarding schools. If the rest of their family is lost, will that person be able to move forward in their life and in their future generations having any identity rooted in where they've come from? Or does that just get washed away, especially, with the displacement of people and is that an issue in... I'm assuming that's an issue in Indigenous groups in the United States. And like, what if is there a big movement of people trying to find where they came from as well?
Yeah. I think another thing that comes into play here is forced adoptions. So for decades, Native children were sold into white families as another way to assimilate or to remove us from our culture. And this was a practice, it was a pretty widespread practice. In 1978, I believe, Indian Child Welfare Act was passed sometime along that. And this act aimed to keep Native children within Native families, because it was recognized that this was being used as a way to separate a Native child from their family, from their land. And there were not necessarily reasons why they were taken. And oftentimes, just cultural differences such as not being raised in a quote unquote nuclear family were reason enough to remove a child. We have a lot of intergenerational households and families and a lot of grandparent involvement, and a child is raised by, their extended family, not just the immediate family. And so this was used at times as a way to remove that child. And this has happened within my own family and my family members who are, returning to the family as an adult and, trying to work through the trauma that they experienced from this forced adoption. So that definitely is a factor, Becca, in people not knowing, their family history or where they come from. And
it's basically kidnapping. Like forced adoption is kidnapping.
It is exactly kidnapping. Yeah. I always try to avoid being super problem saturated, right? Like these conversations are very difficult. We understand that there's a lot of disparity and atrocity that takes place in Native American communities, but our resiliency is also something to celebrate. So in that vein, there are programs like the two that stand out are in the Lakota Nation and the Anishinaabe people. So those are what we know as Ojibwe people, have what's called homecoming organizations or homecoming departments for each of their nations. So if people can somehow find some semblance of affiliation to either of those tribes, they're welcomed back in. There's a ceremony for them. There's conversations about who their families may or may not be. And then every year they have a whole powwow welcoming that person back home. So they're home to the community. It's not necessarily that they're coming home to a nuclear family, like Cali mentioned. They're coming home to their people. And that really is empowering for these. And we're talking, some of these folks are into their 60s and 70s, just now having these ceremonies and just now finding some peace and healing from all of the trauma they've endured in their whole life. Like imagine not knowing who your people are and always feeling a little bit disconnected from everybody around you because they're not your people. Our indigenousness is also attached to our land and our tactile relationship to the earth and to the way we harvest and gather. So if you don't have that your entire life, knowing that you're a Native American person, there's also a level of disconnect there. So those programs for the Lakota people and for the Anishinaabe people should be celebrated in that they're doing their best to reach out and open arms to their people who may have been lost to them. And I loved seeing the pictures. I love hearing them celebrate and talk about it. Because in those ceremonies, they also have conversations around addiction and mental health and men's support groups for those who've chose to use violence. And there's just like all of these rehabilitative and restorative programs to bring this community back together and to pull all of those threads tighter. So I would love to see that in every Indigenous nation, like especially those most adversely impacted by the forced adoption, the displacement to boarding schools, but bringing our people home is important.
I'd like to speak on that real quick because I was actually part of that ceremony.
Yes.
Yeah. So I was adopted at birth, and I was adopted from Sicangu Lakota family into a Sicangu Lakota family. My adoptive mother was white, though, so my adoptive father is Native. So both families are from the same nation. So I did grow up, knowing who I was. I wasn't forced or separated in that way. But I had heard about this welcome home ceremony from one of my relatives who did experience that forced adoption and separation from their family. And I knew I was going up to Rosebud Fair that summer. And I just kind of kept it in the back of my mind. I was like, I'm not going to make a big deal out of it. I'm not going to reach out. I'm just going to play it by ear and see what happens. So I get there and I was with my husband and he knows nothing of what's going on. And I was just like, I'll be right back. And so I snuck off to meet this group. And I was like, hey, do you think I could join? I was adopted and, I grew up my whole life 1,000 miles away. And I don't know if this is for me or who it's for. And of course they were so welcoming and said, of course, come here, get in line. They wrapped me in a shawl. And here I was. I really honestly had no clue what was going on. But we had the ceremony. They announced us by our birth family's name and our adoptive family's name. And then we went around the circle in the powwow grounds and were greeted by every member that was out there. And I was actually able to find some more of my birth family through this ceremony that I just showed up at like 2 minutes before it started, because they had heard my birth mother's name being announced. So I met one of my aunts, and I met some of my siblings that had also been adopted. I had met some of their families, and it was just a really empowering and beautiful ceremony.
Wow.
And Sandy Whitehawk is the woman who started this on the Rosebud Reservation. And they created a documentary called Blood Memory, and it's streaming this entire month for free. And I encourage everybody to watch it. It just shows you, this complex subject of the pain and then what you gain when you return. And it just had me in tears. And I love what they're doing. It shows you both sides. And yeah, thank you for bringing that up, because sometimes I get sucked into
the problem saturation. Yeah, I love that for you. Thank you for sharing that. I love that for you. Oh, so great.
Is going kind of off of that vein, could we talk a little bit about what that connection with the land looked like? Like, how did these Native peoples live on this land, and how, could we talk a little bit about that history and what life looked like?
So Broads, one more quick pause. All of you original Chatty Broads listeners already know that when it comes to shoes around here, we definitely play favorites, but now our most loved shoe brand, of course, it's Rothy's. It not only makes, they not only make the cutest shoes on the market, but they also make bags as well, which I love. And like their shoes, Rothy's bags are curated with eco-friendly materials like repurposed plastic water bottles and marine plastic.
Yes, you heard that right. Marine plastic. Water bottles, to be specific. To date, Rothy's has transformed nearly 70 million water bottles into thread that's then used on their products. But the eco-friendly focus doesn't stop there, because from start to finish, Rothy's prioritizes sustainability in their manufacturing. And the best part, all of their products are 100% machine washable. So this means when your shoes or bag are starting to look a little drab, instead of running out and buying another, toss them in the washer and you're going to get a refresh.
Yes. Oh, also love that for the kiddos' shoes.
Yes.
They're always looking great. Glamour magazine recently named Rothy's one of the top gift ideas you can't go wrong with, and it really is no surprise. I love my Rothy's shoes. I always wear my point black. They're the most popular pair on Rothy's for a reason. They also have some really great new styles out there. And they're also my favorite go-to when I want to look put together on the fly, but also very comfortable. I bought my mother a pair of Rothy's for Christmas because she always compliments me on mine every time I wear them. So if you hear this, Mom, just act surprised when you open it, but you're going to be very excited.
Get all the amazing shoes, bags, and masks available right now at rothys.com/chatty. That's rothys.com, rothys.com/chatty. Style and sustainability meet to create your new favorites. Head to rothys.com/chatty today.
Well, on another note, this year has tested all of our patience. Hooray! I'm constantly trying to find new ways to relax and unwind, and I found a game that's been helping me do it. It's my fave new game. It's called Solitary Grand Harvest. Listen, I grew up playing solitary on my parents' PC. Shout out to all my 80s and 90s babies out there. Oh, I was so obsessed with it, and now I'm obsessed with Grand Harvest. As soon as I opened the app, it felt like cozy and at home again, playing it in this wild world.
Oh yeah, I definitely remember the amount of hours I spent playing solitaire. I don't know if I even fully understood the concept of the game, but I do remember being able to switch the designs of the cards.
Yes.
That alone was entertaining to young me. It's a big deal. Anyway, Solitaire Grand Harvest is like old school solitaire, but it's way upgraded. So the app's always filled with challenging levels and different variations of games, so you can play anywhere, anytime.
I love that it's still engaging, but the graphics are cute and fun. It still feels like you're taking a brain break, you know? I like to play a quick game when I'm unwinding for the night. And of course, if you know me, I am competitive when it comes to games. And that means that my husband and I are constantly trying to one-up each other and get to the next level before each other. Friendly competition, of course, with some fun bets we've placed recently. If you know what I mean.
Ooh.
Winking at the camera.
Whether you're stuck inside or just dreaming of the great outdoors, now you can have a fun farm-style getaway right at your fingertips. Download Solitaire Grand Harvest for free today in the Apple App Store, Google Play, and Amazon.
So there was an era of anthropologists who called Native Americans just nomads, right? Ignoring the fact that some indigenous nations had cities, like whole ass cities built in the United States before it was the United States, right? So we can't ignore the fact that we had full economies, full patterns of migration and movement, because it ignored like the cultural relevance of why we were attached to the land in the way that we are, or not attached, right? In my tribe specifically, in my nation specifically, we are salmon people. So we follow the migration of the salmon season by season. Where we can acquire it the easiest is where we'll set up camp. We also do that same practice with big game. Where is our food? And if you follow and track the natural ecological patterns of big game, elk, moose, deer, bears, they are navigating the land based on seasonal warmth, right? Where is it tepid? Where are they going to be safe and comfortable? Why wouldn't humans follow the same patterns, right? Like, why would we just be out here running amok randomly somewhere on the land? Like it's just this really interesting like perspective to completely ignore the fact that what they see as nomadic, which has a connotation of being haphazard, is actually seasonal movement. And it was the same places every year, every season. We have artifacts that have been dug up, unfortunately, and, studied for how long that pattern of behavior was taking place. Where we had controlled fires, our cultural burns, same place every year. The reason why that's done, controlled burns kind of as an aside, is because the fauna at the floor of the forest grows back, like just flourishes the next 2 seasons after a wildfire. So they're essentially creating a space where they know there will be big game a couple of seasons after a forest was set on fire. So all of it is science, all of it is ecological and savvy on how to live and be a part of the land. Our creation stories also ensure that we are honoring and respecting our relationship to land, and that we don't over extract, we don't dig into the land, that we are never taking more than we need, that we don't waste, that we are honoring a sacrifice that an animal makes to be our sustenance. We use as much of the animal as we can. We don't poison or toxify our water. Like, that's also, our relationship to water is really important. And so it's, and I wish we could say, well, I'm not even going to say that, like the way you asked the question was like, what was our relationship like? No, this is what our relationship is, which is why we're able to maintain our sovereignty over this land, and why we champion so much for our own stewardship of the land. Thankfully, why certain practices around national monuments and national parks in the United States, there's always somebody who's indigenous at that table dictating to folks like, this is the relationship and this is how the land needs to be protected. And, climate justice in the United States at its core is led by indigenous people, because our relationship is about justice for the planet, justice for the environment, justice for the water. So it's an ongoing relationship, and we're doing what we can despite colonization, despite having to live now in this contemporary capacity, but still respecting what is left of nature and still honoring, the way that she moves and the way she behaves.
I was just thinking, as you were saying, you were talking about how it's a very pointed way of moving around. It all makes sense. And I was just thinking that that's, I guess, a tactic of this colonial narrative to say that it's this aimless roaming, because if people are just aimlessly roaming, then you're not taking anything away from them, because nothing was theirs in the first place. So it's like a way to water down what was actually done, I suppose.
Yeah. If you, there's a couple of books that address this, but 1491 comes to mind. And then the Indigenous Peoples' History of the United States also comes to mind. But it talks about where you find the confluence of rivers in the United States, there was likely a full-blown economic urban center for Indigenous people in that space. If you follow the natural migration routes of Indigenous people, what we know of them now, they would likely follow rivers or likely follow weather patterns, right? So it's strategic. It wasn't aimless roaming, but to consider it aimless, like you said, to underscore that was to perpetuate the narrative of savages, right? That we didn't know how to be on the land just because we weren't farming it. Also excluding the stories of agriculture that come out of the Southwest, right? Those were some of the oldest agricultural practices on the planet. And yet we don't name those in some of our books in our history and literature and science, and that's an important truth that I think that we need to center in some of these conversations, that we existed and flourished as Indigenous people before contact, and those ways of knowing still survived.
It's sort of like this super twisted act of like twisting the narrative of this white saviorism, I suppose, is like I think what a lot of people are sold is like we helped, which is kind of disgusting when you say it out loud. It's like, oh, we somehow helped these people who didn't know what they were doing. And anyway, please continue.
Going off of what you said, Tai, it reminds me of Chicago and how many Indigenous nations use those waterways as a trade route. And I recall a few years ago, looking a little bit deeper into the Indigenous history of the Chicagoland area where I grew up, and discovering that there was trade routes where there are now highways, like I-88, Interstate 88, I-94, 294. 355, those were all Indigenous trading routes that were well established that just became highways. And same with California. I know the Nimiipuu Trail, which is known as John Muir Trail now, going up through Yosemite, that was an Indigenous trading route also.
Wow.
So, there's proof. There's proof that we had these flourishing ecosystems and economies, and it's there.
Yeah. And we still see it. I mean, if there's a highway on it now, it was because of Indigenous people, right? I had a sociology professor back in the day. God, it's been a long time since I've been out of college. And he was this white guy who cautioned us against white saviorism and called himself out for it all the time in class. But he always had this funny saying. He's like, it's not a good idea unless a white guy thinks of it, right? And that's basically all of education, all of academia, everything that we know and understand as misconceptions for Indigenous people, because it's not the truth if a white guy doesn't say it's the truth. And that's what we come up against every day of our lives.
What you were just talking about with the John Muir Trail, it was like that was invented by this white guy who explored these places for the first time.
Yeah, I mean, all national parks
with air quotes for audio listeners.
Conversely to that, like there's a couple of dead man's passes in the United States. Those were definitely white folks who didn't know how to travel or navigate the mountains, right? Like not in a horrid sort of like morbid way, but I mean, the dead man's pass was an Indigenous people. I will tell you that 90%, 95% of the time.
It's like they just keep going back to this pass just over and over. It's like, God. Oh, well, you had mentioned when we were discussing earlier misconceptions, and you brought up things that have been culturally appropriated. And can we talk about how, because I know I feel like a narrative that I've heard a lot is, well, I'm, from a white person saying, well, I'm celebrating it. I don't know why this is considered, something that is wrong. Can we talk about why that is, it is violence to the level, especially now. I feel like you go into some of these stores, I'll call out Los Angeles to the max. You walk into these stores and it's sage, it's native art, it's all these things. Can we discuss that?
All of it made in China.
Yeah, it's nice and it's not local. It's not.
Or made by artisan workers who are all white people living in Los Feliz.
Yeah, Silver Lake.
I'm glad that you used the language that appropriation is violence against Indigenous people. That is a really great way to put that. And it's the continued erasure of Indigenous people also. These are cultural practices, art, language, spirituality that we were literally killed for. We lost lives so that these practices could continue to exist. So for folks who are non-native to appropriate it and then claim to be celebrating or honoring our people are one, short-sighted, two, very selfish, and three, are ignoring the fact that this came at the cost of millions of lives. Coachella is also the worst. Like, let's call Coachella out for all of the headdresses and that nonsense that gets rocked. like in my nation, for example, headdresses are passed from generation to generation, warrior to warrior. I don't think that we have any women currently who are headdress wearers, because each of those feathers, right, represent a good deed or some gift that that person had given to the community in a good way, in a selfless way. So there's a lot of power and spirituality that is attached to headdresses. So just rocking that half naked at a Coachella event really is just the most disrespectful, dishonorable thing that could be taking place. And for the love of everything that is good in the world, white folks need to stop telling Indigenous people how we need to be honored, right? It goes the other way around. If we want to be honored, we'll tell you how we want to be honored. Usually we can be honored with our land back. Like that's also I can say that again. I'll say that like every 20 minutes. Give our land back. That's how you can honor us. Cali, I don't know if you had anything to add to the appropriation thing.
Yeah, I'll just go on a little bit about the headdress thing because we just, passed Halloween. Which is
Yes.
a big month.
Mm-hmm.
We go from like Columbus Day to Halloween to Thanksgiving, and there's always some discussion around Halloween costumes and the harm that can come from that. And you already spoke on the headdress and why those are sacred to us. And also, Native peoples are the only people who can legally own an eagle feather. So all of these imitation headdresses are just that imitation. But going on the Pocahontas costumes or the reservation hottie, I think that was what it was called 2 years ago. This is perpetuating hypersexualization of Native women. And like we briefly discussed earlier, we have an epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women. And Indigenous women face much higher rates of sexual violence and rape. Going back to Pocahontas, going back to first contact with settlers. And people are often thinking, this is harmless. How could me dressing like this cause harm against you? I have a friend, Corinne Rice. She's done work with the Native communities in Minnesota as far as education with sex trafficking. She's dove into this topic extensively. There's pornography that depicts Native women and white men with a clear power struggle. And when you start to hypersexualize, you create these fantasies. And the next step with that is fulfillment. And this is how our women are taken and assaulted. And it is correlated. Even mascots or imagery, mockery, Washington football team, the Chicago Blackhawks. A lot of people think that's harmless, but there's been research done by the American Psychological Association that shows this does impact Native people, specifically Native youth, who are seeing their culture be mocked. It's taking the control away from us and how we want to show ourselves in our culture, and it's placing it into a white person's hands. And there's been a lot of work, as you can probably recall, especially this past year with renaming the Washington football team, which I'm so happy has finally happened. It's been decades, since the 60s, that Native groups have been fighting for this. And we are now just finally being heard. As also the baseball team, I can't remember Cleveland Indians. They also removed their mascot recently. But there's data, there's research that shows this is harmful, and it needs to stop. So
there's some, I'm always like an action-oriented person. So I want to give folks some action steps who are listening, like, well, what can I do? Right? Like they want permission. So instead of buying Native inspired, buy artwork from natives, inspired natives, right? Like that's the theme and the tagline from 8th Generation by Louis Gong in Seattle. 8th Generation Marketplace has several different textiles and artworks from very prominent Indigenous artists. It's Indigenous made, it's incredible artwork. If you come across somebody who's Indigenous selling at a market, buy that artwork. You don't always have to wear it, but the appreciation is that you have bought it and supported a Native American artist. And then use the lens of, am I buying this so that I can showcase it? Like, is it about me or is it about the art itself, right? Art appreciation isn't necessarily have to be a direct like showcase of something that I'm doing. It can be the purchase of, and you appreciate it and then pay it forward to the next person. So always purchase from Indigenous artists if you can. Here's the other thing that we do, because this is capitalism and capitalism is poison. So we have Native artists who will sell beaded medallions for $700, $800, $900. And folks will scoff at that price as if laying all of those individual size 15 beads and then tacking them down over the course of several hours isn't laborious. Art is art. That is an artwork that needs to be appreciated at its value rather than trying to be negotiated, rather than trying to get it for free. So those are things that I tend to see happen. So be cautious. There are articles too. And I'm also, again, if you're action oriented, Google it. What is a cultural appropriation? And then how can you avoid it? People have written several articles about it. I do want to underscore the MMIW piece though. So thank you, Cali, for bringing that up about the hypersexualization and exoticization of Native American women. Native American women as a race in the United States are 2.5 times more likely to be assaulted in our lifetime, 2 times more likely to be stalked, 5 times more likely to experience interracial violence. And in that statistic, the interracial violence is a white partner to an Indigenous woman, much like Cali said. And then we are 10 times more likely to be murdered on some reservations. So just let that marinate. Compared to every other race in the country, Indigenous women are 10 times more likely to be murdered. More than 1 in 3 Indigenous women will be raped in her lifetime. I am one of those 3. I have been raped in my lifetime. And then 6 of 10 Indigenous women will be physically assaulted. I have also survived domestic violence. So these are all really heavy, painful symptoms of trauma and violence against Indigenous people. So unless we acknowledge how the intersections of appropriation, the misrepresentation, the misconceptions, all of those intersections perpetuate racism and oppression against Indigenous people, then we're never really going to get to a place where we can move forward with healing, move forward with a place of understanding and shared responsibility. So this is a community safety issue. It's a community accountability issue, not just your white feelings hurt because they can't wear something that looks Native American that was bought in China. And this is my real talk in all of this, right? So in order to be good neighbors to each other, these are the conversations that we need to be having.
And there are plenty of Native artists that you can buy from. I mean, we have beaters, we have people making denim, we have people making dresses, children's books, we have artists, we have singers, actors, actresses, models. I mean, name it and we have it.
Now we have congressmen. Hey. Yeah. Yes. I mean, that only took 176 years. That's fine. Yeah. Congresswomen, I should say. So we are nowhere near as represented as we should be in all of these spaces, political, social, art, Hollywood. We need intentional centering of our voices. And that's the work that I continue to do. And any Native nonprofit, much like what Cali is building, like all of those need to be supported in a vast way. I'm a believer that the way we spend our money is a statement of our values. So if we are continuing to spend money at Urban Outfitters while ignoring the needs of Indigenous communities and supporting Indigenous artists, then we're going to continue to just be hamsters sprinting in a wheel.
I'm curious about, with reservations, were there any peoples that were allowed to stay on their lands when any in the United States historically?
Yeah, my reservation is on my Indigenous homeland. There are also, and this is another thing people may not know, there are also white people on Indian reservations. So during the Allotment Act, reservations for my tribe came from the Treaty of 1855 and 1863, where my reservation covers 5 counties in north central Idaho. And is it, like I said, about 700,000 acres. And that is our ancestral homeland for like 2 or 3 bands of the tribe. So at that time, there were, I don't know, maybe 8 chiefs is what they would call, but they're just like heads of families, more or less. Oddly enough, they were recognized as men, but we're a matriarchy. So I'm sure there were women behind the scenes that never got written into history books, right? But I know our families are ran by women. So while it's a bunch of men's names in the history books and on these rolls, I know that there is a woman close by making those decisions. Yeah. So my reservation, short answer, yes, my reservation is on my ancestral homeland. The reservation itself is only in Idaho, but our ancestral homeland covers eastern Oregon and Washington, northern Idaho, and western Montana and Wyoming. We harvest our buffalo at the north gate of Yellowstone National Park, so it's Gardner, Montana area. And there's about 4 or 5 tribes where every year we go in and harvest our buffalo in that space, because that's also our ancestral territory.
Mine also exists within our ancestral territories, which used to span from the west side of the Mississippi River to Montana, Wyoming. So we're located in the southern central part of South Dakota.
How and why were these territories created in the first place?
Prison, and then access to resources. So reservations were built strategically, especially if there was gold, timber, or some other resource that could be extracted or mined or harvested commercially in those areas. So ours at the time was agricultural space. They wanted to farm our land and then harvest timber. And the timber that was harvested here was all sent back east for an exorbitant amount of money. Like, it was ridiculous how much money was made off of the timber from Nimiipuu land. It's also about, like, where's gold? Where are the headwaters of certain rivers? Where are the trade routes? How do you move north, south, east, and west without going through indigenous homeland? Because at one point, we were still fighting and defending our land. So we would be attacking some of these trade routes to make sure that nobody could get through,
Okay. So kind of lining up with sort of mainstream history, this is probably during like the gold rush era in the 1800s or even earlier.
It was earlier.
Okay.
So westward expansion started in 1810, give or take. I mean, Lewis and Clark traveled in 1804, 1805, and 1806. And then so after they returned to St. Louis, Missouri, then they were able to open up the West, right?
Okay.
Open up the West for settlement. So then it was traders and settlers, and the Oregon Trail then started at that point, bringing disease and virus and whatever other atrocities that took place in history.
Oh, I'm sorry. I think you were still saying that, like, at that point, the Native people were still fighting back, and then we were talking about the establishment of the reservations.
Oh, yeah. Sorry. So as Indigenous folks were continuing to defend our land prior to, and this is, let me timeline this. So westward expansion started, that was pre-gold rush, and then the Indian War started. So that's when the cavalry came in. And then once the cavalry came through, then gold rush started. So some of these eras overlapped one another. But it wasn't until there was actual resources that could be tangibly harvested in mass were we then isolated to Indian reservations. And then once we were isolated to the reservation or imprisoned on the reservation, our weapons were also taken from us. Our horses were taken from us, that kind of thing. So we were left with flour and lard and salt in a lot of cases.
Is that done by the army, or how was this done?
Using the army.
Okay.
Yeah, using the army. So Lapwai, Idaho is more or less the capital. I mean, it's where our governing body resides for the Nez Perce tribe. And it used to be Fort Lapwai, Idaho. So if that gives you any indication, and there's always going to be a fort somewhere near or around an Indian reservation or a historical site that was a fort at one point. Yeah.
Okay. And going back even before then, what about the initial settlers, the European people that were coming over in like the 1600s and 1700s, dating all the way back to Columbus? Sort of, what did that look like in the colonization of those areas? Were the people just then forced out, and that was something that eventually expanded until the points that you were talking about in the 1800s of forcing people onto reservations?
Yeah, so those early interactions, like we have some old oral history that talks about Spanish exploration as far north as Idaho. So Spanish exploration started in the southern, southwestern United States. So Mexico, also indigenous, was colonized by Spain, right? So their impact of colonization mirrors a great deal of what happened to indigenous people in the United States. But during that exploration, before it was ever United States territory, that exploration was like it was really just exploration. Like they tried to conquer, but they didn't have a good idea of how to move or navigate the land. Some of the tribes in the southwestern United States were just really big, and you have a cavalry of 15 Spanish soldiers. You're not going to be able to overtake a whole city of, of people. So it was, I don't think that the impact of those early exploration, early conquerors had much impact. Otherwise we'd see it in history books, right? What I have is only oral history and artifacts.
Although, was that the early introduction of disease, or was that later on? Because this is also something, we're very briefly taught about in primary education.
Yeah, the disease piece, that started as early as Columbus. Within that first 10 years, I think it was like 60 million Indigenous people lost their lives. Yeah. 60 million. And it actually, from a scientific standpoint, caused a global cooling rather than like a global warming. So it's to take that many humans off the planet in a short window of time caused ecological changes.
The lack of the carbon output, like from those individuals.
Individual bodies, in those short, in those spaces, right? So those were all islands and archipelagos, the southern United States, southwestern and southeastern United States, what we now know as the United States. So that disease, there are people who argue that wasn't the fault of Columbus or any explorers that came on, that came through. But if we have no immunity, what do they expect to happen? There was an interesting meme. I actually read it just before we got on our call together, where it's like, bringing disease to a family with very little immunity seems like a very quintessentially Thanksgiving thing to do. And it's laughable, painfully laughable, right? The irony is not lost, right? People need to stay home. There's a pandemic on and we can't expose each other because we all have very little immunity, any at all. So we've come full circle, 1600s to 2020. Yeah.
Well, speaking of Thanksgiving, can we touch on that? Because we mentioned, this is dropping on Thursday, November 20, I don't even know, the 27th, whatever it's going to be. And it's a day where a lot of the United States is celebrating Thanksgiving. Can we talk about the actual history of what that looked like first? And then I would love to talk about, for instance, Becca and I are both parents. One of my big goals is to make sure that my daughter is educated correctly on what this, quote unquote, holiday actually is moving forward with our family.
Yeah. And also, Tai, you brought up earlier that you're like, I like to give actionable steps. So at any point too in the conversation, if you're like, these are actual things that you can do or participate in or things you can read, please feel more than free to include that.
Well, the Thanksgiving story myth doesn't include my specific Indigenous nation. It's the story of the Mashpee Wampanoag people. And this myth talks about how it was a celebratory dinner between the Pilgrims and the Indians. The Mashpee Wampanoag, they live on the east coast of the country, currently known as Cape Cod. And they were there for the first contact with settlers. So this was not, the Mayflower was not the first or the second time they had encountered European settlers and colonizers. But this specific time, they showed up with a boatload of unprepared people who had trouble adapting to the land and had trouble feeding themselves and keeping themselves sustained. The Mashpee Wampanoag people did help those settlers survive, teach them how to harvest. And eventually, after 6 months of living near each other, they signed a mutual treaty of protection, saying that they would protect each other from any outside attacks. And the specific night, there was a lot of gunfire and noise coming from the European settlement area. And the Mashpee Wampanoag people went over to see what was going on, to scope it out, since they had signed in this mutual treaty of protection. And they found that there was not an attack, but a celebration. They were celebrating a large harvest. The Mashpee Wampanoag people had not been invited to this big celebration, although, you know, our school textbooks tell us that they were, and that they all sat down and enjoyed a meal together. Yeah. And this story I've listened to from two Mashpee Wampanoag scholars, Paula Peters and Linda Coombs, and they actually just released a podcast episode, Thanksgiving or Thanks-Taking, which discusses this in further detail. Again, it's their story. Really, I can give you a condensed version, but the podcast is found on All My Relations, which is an Indigenous podcast.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. We'll include that in the episode notes, Broads, by the way. Yeah.
And then, you know, like 350 years later, there was a Wampanoag man, Frank Peters, who was invited to speak in Cape Cod about the anniversary of the arrival of the Mayflower. And he had his speech written out and prepared, and he was suddenly uninvited. And this was due to his speech discussing the war, the genocide, the disease that was brought in when the Mayflower arrived. And instead of giving this speech at this specific event, he ended up giving it to a group of Indigenous people. And that day became known as the National Day of Mourning in 1970, which is a day that is commemorated across Indian country from coast to coast. And then in 2007, the Mashpee Wampanoag, the same people who had first contact with the settlers, were finally given federal recognition status from President Obama in like 2008. And during the Trump administration, that federal status is now back in court, trying to be revoked, trying to take their land away. So it just kind of shows you how much can happen in centuries. You know, where are we at today? I'm not up to date on, as of right now, where that legal battle is at. Maybe Tai, you might know some more about that.
I think we're on the same page. I haven't heard any movement in that case recently either.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good recap of what actually happened. It's a celebration of a massacre rather than, you know, this exchange of, you know, healing and thankfulness. And I contributed to an article last year on CNN. It was an internet article on Thanksgiving and how we can talk to kids about Thanksgiving or Thanks-Taking or Day of Mourning, however we choose to recognize it. I personally do not celebrate Thanksgiving. It's a day I spend, or it's a whole weekend I spend with my brother, generally hunting or hanging out with family. And that's what Congresswoman Holland was talking about, was that it's an opportunity to be intentionally thankful, even though that is a practice that we have daily in Indigenous communities, especially communities that practice sweat house or longhouse, right? Like that's a very consistent, always expressing gratitude, always expressing love. It's not a kind of a one and done kind of a deal. Same goes for Mother's Day. Ironically, we thank our mothers all the time. We recognize and honor our matriarchy all the time. Yeah.
What a novel idea.
Weird women being centered in the conversation. Yeah. So some of the action steps I suggested for folks that were reading is that review what work your school is sending home for your children to do in response to Thanksgiving. Are they using appropriate language? Is the artwork designed by somebody who's Native American? Are they sharing a Native American story of Thanksgiving? Are they talking about the real story of what happened and not this myth that gives everybody warm fuzzies? And I know parents, I'm not a parent. I actually am allergic to children, but my understanding is that kids are really resilient and very open to having conversations, even about things that adults think they may not understand, right? I have two nieces, they're 8 and 12 now, but I've been having what we would consider adult conversations with them for a very, very long time. And they always get it. I put it in words that they can receive. I have them repeat it back to me so I know that they retain and understand. And anytime they want to circle back to that conversation, we do. I used to invest a lot of energy in going to classrooms in whatever neighborhood I was living to tell the true story of Thanksgiving, but that doesn't ever bode well with families who are white or Christian, and you have this Indigenous person telling them that Thanksgiving is a garbage holiday. So I have stopped doing that. And then the other piece to that too is, so not just the books, reviewing what they're learning in school, but what is your ongoing effort around ensuring that true Indigenous history is being shared across the board, not holiday by holiday, but what does the curriculum look like across the board? I always try to tell educators and parents, like, Native American history isn't its own lane. Native American history is American history, right? Like, we create what we now know as the United States. So our history is literally the foundation and the backbone of this settler colonial occupancy now. So we have to be better about having these conversations. So those are kind of the high level things. I love the suggestion of the All My Relations podcast, which is phenomenal. I tend to be a little bit more anarchist than most. So I love the Indigenous Action podcast. They are Indigenous anarchists and have a really great discussion about things taking and land back and decolonizing land acknowledgements and that kind of thing.
When we were talking about educating children too, I was just thinking how as white parents, I think we have the tendency to overcomplicate the discussion because we have no issue. Jess and I both grew up Christian. We have no issue telling 3 and 4-year-olds about Jesus getting nailed to the cross or being beaten to death or having a crown of thorns put on his head. Extremely violent, graphic stories that we're telling young children. And like the way we teach children in schools too about the Holocaust. And we get very explicit and very graphic and very real about those descriptions. And it seems something that I've tended to do myself too, is sort of this choke up of like, well, how am I going to talk to my child about like these violent atrocities, as if that's not something we already incorporate into our education on a regular basis.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, no, I think being a parent as well, I that pullback, which I'm guilty of, after, the murder of George Floyd and my daughter were driving and, there's people holding signs and then we're participating in a protest and she obviously is like, let's talk about this. And my immediate, reaction is, how am I going to frame this for her because she's young? Well, spoiler alert, like she processed it. And it was something that she needed to hear. And so, I think it's just and I'm grateful for the reminder is, when we're having these conversations with our little ones, it's like, no, these conversations have to be had and they'll understand. So for us now, and our listeners, I've talked about some actionable steps. Love to hear, from both of you with maybe the work that you both are currently doing. If there's anything that our listeners and ourselves can, obviously you've thrown out some great recommendations for podcasts, but whether it be different nonprofits, Cali, yours, different resources that we can continue this conversation. And like you were saying, Tai, not just about the Thanksgiving holiday and all the lies that were told about this, but just to continue this and continue the conversation. Yeah.
And also places where we can sort of like witness sort of the reclamation of like how you were talking about, what was the celebration that you touched on earlier that you were a part of, Cali?
Oh, the welcome home ceremony.
Yeah. And maybe if there's just other things you can highlight of like active ways that Indigenous people are getting their land back and are sort of like reclaiming the culture too that's been taken or not taken.
Stolen.
Yeah, stolen.
Well, like I mentioned before, I do work with Native Women's Wilderness, which is a nonprofit, mainly in the outdoor industry. But part of my job as a coordinating director is to organize efforts to give back to our communities that raised us, to the nations where we come from. This past spring, our founder, Jalen, she organized an effort on the Navajo Nation where she's from for COVID-19 relief. So she was able to deliver personal care items and also food boxes to families in need on the Navajo Nation. And during this time of year, we start to organize our Native Women's Wilderness Gives Back campaign. And it will likely, again, focus on COVID-19 just due to the ongoing pandemic and how it's impacting more of our Native communities. Specifically, South Dakota, following Sturgis Motorcycle Festival, that the state has seen over 50% positivity rates. And every day I see another family member, a relative or friend back at Rosebud, either testing positive or losing another family member. So I do want to let people know that the Rosebud Sioux Tribe website has a COVID-19 relief fund where people can donate either money or masks or gloves. And to keep an eye out for our fundraiser that should be going live sometime within this next week as well.
Sounds like incredible work, Cali. Thank you. I always love to see, this is something to celebrate, right? For listeners, Indigenous women are just badass. Like we've been carrying our communities for hundreds of years, and we still continue to do so and actively create solutions if solutions don't already exist towards our resilience and for our thriving and for abundance in our communities. So I appreciate when I meet people who are also doing this work like with me, even though we're not in the same community. So I appreciate you. A lot of gratitude, Cali. I work in a couple of different places. So like I said, I work for the Idaho Coalition Against Sexual Domestic Violence. My work there is specifically around domestic violence and sexual assault in Native American communities. At all times, we are constantly fundraising for missing and murdered Indigenous women's research, data analysis, mapping, building and creating summits for intertribal and interagency collaboration. All of this takes money. I, more importantly, am about to start a fundraising campaign for the Indigenous Idaho Alliance. And that has been a fledgling nonprofit for several years. We are now officially a 501c3 as of this year, but the funds that we're raising and a lot of our efforts have been going towards feeding communities in the face of COVID-19. So those of you who are in urban settings may not know this. There is an Indigenous nation, the Fort McDermott tribe, which are Paiute Shoshone people. Once they had one infection of COVID, the whole town got it, the whole community got it. And so that's like 300 or 400 people. And then their one tiny convenience store, which is like a little half gas station, was wiped out of all of the food. They had curfews, so couldn't really go in and out of town because they were isolating. So what we ended up doing was fundraising and supply drive for them. In about 36 hours, we had food and produce and meat and cheese and dog food and cleaning supplies. And we were able to truck it down. Like it was a full 20-foot trailer that was filled to the brim that was sent down to that reservation. We still have those needs. These communities who are remote, anywhere between 3 and 4 hours away from an urban center, don't have access to basic human needs and resources, which are water, food, PPE. So that fundraising drive, we're going to kick it off on Giving Tuesday, which is December 1st. We'll be fundraising all the way through January. If you're local, you're listening and you're local to Boise, Idaho, I will be taking supplies at the Linen Building downtown. But they can find more information on that fundraiser from the Indigenous Idaho Alliance Facebook page. And then my efforts as an individual woman, I'm both Black and I'm Indigenous. I'm an anti-racism educator. I'm an anti-oppression educator, and I'm a storyteller, right? So any opportunity that I can show up in a space and talk about our more contemporary issues, healthcare access, reproductive access, COVID-19 response, and missing and murdered Indigenous women, supporting Black lives, Indigenous sovereignty, I'm happy to show up and do that work also.
Thank you both so much. I mean, we're both so grateful to have you on and to give us your time. And I'm really looking forward to continuing this conversation because obviously it was just like
an introduction.
And we're both grateful for you both educating us. And just, on a personal note, thank you so much. As like I said, I've said it 5 times, but as a mother, that's been kind of what's been in my mind's eye over the course of this past year to really focus on. And so I'm so grateful for individuals like you taking your time to help me, that I can try to start this conversation with my kiddo.
Thank you so much for both of you joining us. And we really appreciate your time and your energy being here. And I think this is going to be incredibly valuable for our community.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
Thank you for having us. Yeah. It was great to share this space with both of you and Tai. I learned a lot from you as well. And I hope this really provokes a discussion in the listeners and continued education.
Yeah. And then also, where can we find each of you as well?
I'm on Instagram. Instagram at Tai Simpson. Facebook. Facebook's a little bit harder to find me. Tai.Simpson.1 is my handle from Facebook. And those are the only two socials I get on. I'm an old millennial, so social media exhausts me.
No TikTok for you?
I'm on Instagram as well at Cali Wolf. And in the spirit of giving, I have a holiday shopping guide that features all Native shops. So
amazing.
Fantastic.
I'll buy from small businesses.
Awesome.
Awesome. Oh, I have a website too. I'm at TaiSimpson.com.
Perfect.
My TED Talk is there. I want everybody to watch my TED Talk, please.
I watched the TED Talk. It was fantastic. Highly recommend. 10 out of 10.
Awesome.
Well, thank you so much.
And with that,
broads.
chat soon.
Chat soon.